September 21st, 1327, Berkeley Castle. Two masked men enter a cold cell at night. One carries a metal rod glowing red with heat, the other, a horn. The prisoner is tied down, face down, panting. His screams never leave the stone walls. By dawn, he's dead. Official cause, natural causes. The victim, a former king of England. This was not justice, it was a ritual. This is the death of Edward II, the king they killed from the inside out. For 700 years, historians have debated what really happened that night. The horn, the iron, the scream, truth and myth are tangled together, suffocated beneath layers of royal silence and medieval shame. Some say the story was invented, court propaganda meant to demonize a deposed king. Others believe it's all true, and that what happened in the bowels of Berkeley Castle was not just murder, but spectacle. A punishment tailored to fit the man they believed had failed both crown and God. But to understand that night, the muffled agony, the red-hot iron, we must begin at the beginning, not with the death of a king, but with the birth of a disappointment. Edward of Caernarfon was born in April 1284, a prince wrapped in iron expectations. His father, Edward I, was one of the most feared kings in Europe, a brutal tactician, a hammer of rebellions, a man who carved submission into the skin of nations. When Edward was born, it wasn't into a cradle of love, but into a forge. The boy wasn't expected to feel, he was expected to conquer. But Edward didn't fit the mold. He grew into a strange contradiction, tall, handsome, intelligent, but drawn to things no warrior prince should desire. He preferred music to war drills, metalwork to horseback riding. He learned to thatch roofs with peasants. He rode boats. He loved animals, especially his greyhounds, which he dressed in fine fabrics. The court whispered. His father scowled. But Edward did not care. His soul bent toward softness. Then came Piers Gaveston, a minor noble from Gascony. Gaveston was everything Edward craved, charming, daring, rebellious. Their bond was instant, and it went deeper than politics. Some called it friendship, others scandal. Edward's infatuation was open, unashamed. He ignored protocol, gave Gaveston jewels, lands, even the keys to the royal treasury. In private they were inseparable. In public they were inseparable too, which made the nobles furious. When Edward I died in 1307, the kingdom trembled, because now this boy, this prince who dressed his dogs and kissed his favorite on the mouth, was king. One of his first acts, he recalled Gaveston from exile, reinstated his titles, and made him Earl of Cornwall, one of the highest titles in the realm, reserved for royalty. It was not just favoritism, it was defiance. The court exploded. The barons saw it as treason to tradition. Gaveston was mocked for his vanity, his foreign tongue, his influence over the king. In response, Edward elevated him further, even gave him the crown jewels to carry during ceremonies, a symbol reserved for heirs. It was an open wound, and the nobility cut back. By 1312, the lords had had enough. They captured Gaveston, dragged him through a mock trial, and executed him by sword on Blacklow Hill. No public ceremony, no last rites, just steel, blood, and silence. Edward shattered. The grief was not just personal, it was public. He wore mourning clothes longer than custom allowed. He punished the lords when he could. But something in him broke. The man who had never fit the crown now wore it like a shackle. Isolated, despised, desperate, he would never trust the nobility again. And in their eyes he was no longer a king. He was a danger, a failure in a velvet cloak, a man clinging to a throne that no longer recognized him. In 1308, Edward II married Isabella of France. She was just 12 years old, the daughter of the ruthless King Philip IV, known across Europe as the Iron King. The marriage was a political necessity, a bridge between two rival kingdoms, but even on their wedding day the cracks showed. When Isabella arrived with her dowry, jewels intended for her crown were given instead to Piers Gaveston. The insult was deliberate. The French court noticed. So did Isabella. She had come to England to be queen. Instead, she was an ornament, in a drama that centered not on her but on two men, one crowned, one adored. At the coronation feast, Edward sat beside Gaveston, lavishing him with gifts and titles, while Isabella watched in silence. The chroniclers of the time, always cautious with their language, could not hide it. The king loved another more than his wife. Yet Isabella bided her time. She learned, observed, grew into her role with poise. Beneath the public humiliation, a sharper mind developed. She saw that Edward's devotion to Gaveston and later to others wasn't just personal, it was political suicide, and she waited for the moment when England would turn on him. That moment came with Gaveston's death. Edward never recovered from the loss, but his loneliness only deepened his self-destruction. He sought comfort in a new favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Where Gaveston had been flamboyant and charming, Despenser was ruthless, calculating, cold, and he did not share Edward's affections quietly. With Despenser came tyranny. He and his father began to dominate court life, seizing lands, executing rivals, and humiliating barons with the king's blessing. England, already strained by famine and debt, began to buckle. The nobility saw the king falling under another man's spell, and this time they feared it would destroy the realm itself. Isabella watched again, quietly, but her silence had sharpened into strategy. By 1321, the country was on the edge of rebellion. Despenser's enemies rose in arms, and Edward in response unleashed terror. Rebellious lords were executed brutally, castles were confiscated, whole families were punished, Parliament itself shrank in fear. The people starved, but Edward's court grew richer, the Despensers grew bolder. In 1325, Isabella saw her chance. Edward sent her to France as a diplomat, to negotiate with her brother, now King Charles IV. But once in Paris, she refused to return. Instead, she made an alliance of her own, not with kings, but with a man, Roger Mortimer. Mortimer was an English lord who had escaped from the Tower of London after rebelling against Edward. In exile, he found both refuge and power in Isabella's presence. Their relationship, whether romantic or political, became the knife Edward never saw coming. Together, Isabella and Mortimer gathered an army. Funded by foreign support and fueled by hatred, they landed in England in 1326. The invasion was swift, and the kingdom offered little resistance. Nobles defected, cities opened their gates, even Edward's closest allies abandoned him. The king fled, first to Wales, then into the wild, with Despenser clinging to him like a shadow. Edward was a ghost in his own realm, cold, hunted, hollow. Eventually he was captured near Neath Abbey, shivering and soaked. The Despensers were quickly separated from him. The elder was hanged. The younger, Edward's last companion, was dragged through the streets, castrated, disemboweled and quartered before a cheering crowd. Edward was spared the spectacle, but not the consequence. Isabella and Mortimer did not place him on trial. They did not permit a defense. They simply removed the crown. Parliament, under pressure, declared him unfit to rule. His 14-year-old son was crowned Edward III. The father, now nameless, was placed in custody, a deposed king, stripped of title, dignity, and purpose. They didn't just take his crown, they erased him. He was moved from castle to castle, watched, silenced, hidden. Officially, he was still alive. Unofficially, he was already a liability, a whisper, a threat to the new regime. But Edward had one final curse. He would not die, and in the cold halls of Berkeley Castle, that became a problem. Berkeley Castle stood on the edge of nothing, perched in the damp hills of Gloucestershire. It was no grand court, no glittering prison. It was cold, hard, silent, the perfect tomb for a man still breathing. When Edward II was brought here in the spring of 1327, he no longer looked like a king. His hair was thinning, his skin pale and raw from flight and fear. His eyes carried the dull haze of a man unmoored. Gone was the velvet, gone was the crown. What remained was a discarded monarch, and the slow death designed to erase him. His jailers were chosen with care, Thomas Gurney and John Maltravers, men loyal not to Edward, but to Mortimer, men who would not flinch at orders that others might refuse. Their task was not merely to guard the former king, it was to break him, quietly, thoroughly, irrevocably. And so they began with dignity, by stripping it away. Edward was denied proper clothing. His garments were thin, deliberately insufficient for the castle's damp chill. The cell where he was held was bare stone, without bedding, often without light. Food came irregularly, often spoiled. He was forbidden clean water, fresh air, or company. Letters from his allies, if they came at all, were intercepted or destroyed. He was denied a priest, even during Lent. The man who once ruled Christendom's wealthiest kingdom now slept in filth and silence. The goal was never quick death. It was slow rot, psychological degradation, the destruction of identity. Even Edward's title was erased. No longer Your Majesty, no longer Sire, simply the prisoner. He was forced to ride, still under guard, across countryside roads, bareback in rain, without armor or dignity. Locals watched the shivering, gaunt figure pass through villages. Some wept, most turned away. He was a warning more than a man. This is what happens to kings who fail. Yet he endured. Broken in body, he clung to life, to prayer, to some faint hope of redemption or rescue. Letters from supposed allies still trickled in, perhaps faked, perhaps real. Perhaps Edward III, his son, would act. Perhaps not. Time blurred. Seasons changed. His beard grew wild. His voice grew soft. But he lived, and that became the problem. By September, rumors spread that loyalists were planning to free him. Mortimer grew nervous. A living Edward was a dangerous symbol, a rallying point, a ghost too loud to silence by exile alone. He had to be removed. Not executed. That would invite scandal. But extinguished, silently, so that even in death he could not be martyred. Then came the plan. A murder so grotesque, so unspeakable that no one would believe it had happened, or dare repeat it out loud. On the night of September 21st, 1327, two masked men entered Edward's cell. They brought no blade, no rope, no poison. What they carried was worse, a horn and a rod of iron heated until it glowed red. Edward was roused, held down, gagged, pillows over his face to muffle the screams. The horn, a hollow funnel, was inserted into his body. Through it, the red-hot poker was slid, deep, direct, precise. The method ensured there would be no external wound, no blood, no visible mark, just fire from the inside out. According to legend, his screams echoed through the castle until they stopped. By dawn, Edward II was dead. The coroner's report would call it natural causes. No one questioned it publicly. To do so was treason, but privately the rumors bloomed like rot. Whispers spoke of the horn, the fire, the cries, a punishment for a perverse king, not just death but erasure by flame. Some said it was symbolic, meant to cleanse the sin from within. Others said it was revenge. Some just said it was silence, pure and cruel. The body was buried hastily. The news spread slowly. The court offered platitudes, but nothing could bury what had happened at Berkeley. Because even if the tale wasn't true, it had already become truth in the minds of the people. They hadn't just killed a king, they had created a legend, a ghost, seared into the walls. The corpse was cold, but the whispers were burning. Edward II's funeral took place at St. Peter's Abbey in Gloucester, now Gloucester Cathedral. His body, shrouded in secrecy, was buried beneath carved stone and thin ceremony. But the people did not gather to mourn. They gathered to wonder, to whisper, to ask, quietly, what they dared not say aloud. What really happened in that cell? The official cause of death, natural causes, was met with silence by the court, but with disbelief by the world. Even in an age when kings vanished into dungeons and never returned, this disappearance felt unfinished, too clean, too sudden, and far too convenient for those now gripping the crown. Whispers filled the void, the horn, the poker, the muffled screams behind castle walls. The image was too gruesome to forget, and too poetic to ignore. It spread like a stain across Europe. Even the clergy, those trained in caution, began to circulate the tale. But it wasn't just gossip, it became ammunition. Edward III, now king at just 14, had been crowned while his father still breathed. But he hadn't ruled, not really. His mother, Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, pulled the strings, a queen regent and a shadow king. They had removed a monarch, but they had also created a martyr. And Edward III had been watching. In 1330, only 3 years after his father's death, the young king seized power. One autumn night, he stormed Nottingham Castle, arrested Mortimer in his mother's chambers, and had him dragged before Parliament. The charges were clear: usurpation, treason, and the murder of his father. Mortimer was hanged at Tyburn without trial, his body left to rot. Edward III had avenged the father he never saved, but he did not stop there. Isabella, once the she-wolf of France, was spared the noose but not disgrace. She was confined to Castle Rising, far from court, her power stripped, her name blackened. History remembers her as both seductress and strategist, but her son remembered her as something worse, a queen who let a king burn. Still, the questions did not die. Did Edward II truly perish in Berkeley Castle? Some chroniclers claimed he survived, smuggled out by sympathetic guards, living in obscurity as a hermit in Europe. A letter surfaced in 1333, allegedly from Edward himself, sent to the emperor in Italy. It described his escape, his suffering, and his prayers. The handwriting was elegant, the tone regal, and the message clear: I am not dead. Others dismissed it as forgery. Royal theater meant to destabilize Edward III's rule, but the possibility could not be buried. It followed the Plantagenets for generations. A ghost king, always present, never proven. Meanwhile, artists and playwrights resurrected him in ink and fire. Christopher Marlowe's Edward II would later put the iron and horn on stage, horrifying audiences and solidifying the rumor into legend. Even those who knew the tale was exaggerated couldn't forget it. The method of execution, intimate, hidden, symbolic, had wormed into the collective conscience, because it wasn't just about how Edward died. It was about what he represented: a king who loved men in a world that demanded heirs, a ruler who wept where others roared, a monarch who preferred peace to war, softness to steel. To his enemies this made him weak, but to others, in later centuries, it made him human. And that, in the brutal machinery of monarchy, was his greatest sin. His death was a message, a warning, that to defy the role written for you, to stray from the iron mold of kingship, would not just cost you your throne, it would cost you your body, your name, your story. But the punishment backfired. They tried to erase him. Instead, they created a symbol. To this day, Gloucester Cathedral bears his tomb, carved in alabaster, still visited by those who wonder. Not because he ruled well, not because he conquered, but because he suffered, and in that suffering, became unforgettable. Edward II became the king who died without a wound. No sword, no gallows, no public justice, just a whisper in the dark, a burn behind the curtain, and a story too terrible and too human to forget. They wanted him to vanish, not just from power but from memory, not with a blade too visible, not with poison too traceable, but with silence, fire in the dark, pain no one could see. They killed him in such a way that there would be nothing left to bury but questions. And yet Edward II never disappeared. He lingers, not in glory, not in triumph, but in agony. In the image of a king who fell beneath the weight of his own crown, a man torn apart not by sword but by shame. They stripped his name, they took his throne, they burned his body from the inside out, but in doing so they created a ghost. He walks the stone corridors of English history, not as a hero, not even as a martyr, but as a wound that never quite healed, a reminder of what power does to those who don't fit the mold, who love the wrong people, who trust the wrong hearts. The iron rod, the horn, the scream beneath the pillow. Maybe it was myth, maybe not, but the story survived, longer than any of his laws, longer than the men who destroyed him. Because some deaths don't fade, some kings are remembered not for how they ruled, but for how they were erased. And Edward II, he became the king who died without a wound, but left one behind.